Ahoy! This is not the Greatsword video I was planning to make today, but it's one that we need to make today. The New World devs, or the New World team, released a Greatsword showcase. We'll talk more about the Greatsword in the future, but I specifically want to address this first, because it kind of gets some things a little bit wrong, and I think that is something we should talk about. But let's go through it from the beginning. I also show you some of the Greatsword trailer in between, which is absolutely fantastic. I absolutely love what they've done with that. It looks really cool. I love the Blunderbuss trailer already, but the Greatsword trailer is, once again, absolutely premium. As for the post itself, greetings adventurers. The Greatsword is a powerful two-handed weapon like the Great Axe or Warhammer, but uses martial techniques rather than sheer power to vanquish foes. An offensive and defensive stance set it apart in terms of gameplay, while unique visual traits make it feel even more distinct. We joined the design team for a deeper look at the Greatsword's size, stance effects, and heads-up display, plus some other neat tidbits. Gameplay design. The attacks are central to this blade's core design. It embodies relentless offense paired with aggressive defense. Even defensive skills tend to have some kind of attacking component. Whether fighting groups of foes with wide sweeping strikes or single targets with a few specialized skills, the Greatsword can adapt to almost any situation. The stances also give players more freedom for versatile tactics regardless of their preferred playstyle. Size. Its size was a result of desire and practicality. The design team wanted a slightly fantastical, larger-than-life weapon with a weight that was still comparable to the Great Axe or Warhammer. They strove for something large enough to be impressive, but small enough not to not obscure character animations when worn on the character's back. To be honest, while the weapon is being held, it does look kind of ridiculous at times. I feel they went a bit overboard with it because it's very wide as well, especially when you're walking around with it, but at the same time it makes the weapon very recognizable. And now, this is the part that I think is a bit spicy. The functionality comparison. Here's a breakdown of how the Greatsword is weaker than, about the same as, and stronger than the following weapons. Great Axe. Weaker than, less pursuit options. That one is kind of true, because you have charge on the Great Axe and you have reap especially, and you also have Gravwell. But at the same time it's also kind of not true, because what really made the chasing of the Great Axe so strong once upon a time was its tracking, where it would basically glue to enemies like a magnet when you're just spamming light attacks. And the Greatsword actually does that much better, both with light and heavy attacks. So in some ways, it actually ends up chasing better. And its dash is not very strong, it's very slow, but it also has a root when the target is under 50%, I think. So it has less pursuit options technically if you just speak in terms of raw numbers, but it's not necessarily worse in that regard. Also, about the same as DPS. From everything I've tested so far, that is absolutely not the case. I would say the Greatsword absolutely outclasses the Great Axe in DPS by a not insignificant margin, by a lot. Yeah, I think that it's not even close. And then stronger than, it has better buff debuff application. That is most certainly true. Actually the Great Axe has quite a few self buffs as well, but in terms of debuffing, I would say the Greatsword is better. Then we have the Warhammer. Weaker than, no stuns. I would say not just the stuns, I think generally the CC, all of the crowd control on the Greatsword is much weaker than the Warhammer, and that's also going to be a deciding factor for bruisers if they actually want to offhand the Greatsword compared to the Warhammer, and the Warhammer is the one that has all the CC. About the same as abilities that cause reactions. I think this is mainly referring to like reading opponents as well. And I think both the Warhammer and the Greatsword have a lot of relatively telegraphed abilities, so I can see where they're coming from with that. Then, stronger than, faster attacks and DPS. Yep, the Greatsword absolutely has that. Sword and Shield. Weaker than, fewer defensive actions, can't protect allies as well. That's correct. Definitely not as defense focused overall. Definitely can't help allies as much. About the same as block stability on par with light shields. Now this is kind of ironic because like who actually blocks with a light shield? If you're running a light shield, you're using it because you want to run sword with damage. You're not really blocking much except projectiles. But it depends because there is there's a mechanic currently that makes it likely much better than a light shield in terms of blocking and much more on par with a tower shield, which I'm hoping will be fixed though. So we'll see if that holds up. And then there is stronger than, higher range. Debatable. The basic attack range between the sword and the greatsword is very, very similar at least. And other than that, well, there are differences in how the attacks move you. That's more important. But we'll talk about that in the future. But like in terms of range overall, I think they don't take much from each other, especially because the sword has a much better leap as well with leaping strike. So nah, I don't think that one is particularly true. Now we have the Hatchet. It's weaker than in regards to slower attack speed, but then I feel like that's kind of offset by having much faster heavy attack speed. So I don't really know if that's like the big difference. About the same as good self buffing. I don't even know. Well, I think the Hatchet has like a lot of self buffs as well. That is true, but they work very differently. Like the Hatchet self buffs are almost exclusively focused on power of some sort and damage increases, and the Greatsword comes with a fair bit more utility. But yeah, in the end, it's still like around the same together. And then stronger than, higher range. That is correct, but also only if you're going left tree Hatchet. If you're going throwing Hatchet, then the throwing Hatchet most definitely has a lot higher range overall with every ability. The Spear, weaker than, less crowd control options, spacing tools. I would say yes, crowd control options. Spacing tools is maybe debatable. I mean, the Greatsword on the right tree has quite a fair bit of spacing. About the same as similar range. That is probably true for the most part. Not always. Like the Spear will probably have longer reach in a few niche cases. And then stronger than, sweeping attacks instead of linear ones. So AoE. Very true. Like Spear is absolutely way more single target. And then there is a damage scaling comparison here. The team wanted to push the unique aspects of the Greatsword further through even strength and dex damage scaling. This allows players more flexibility when choosing a secondary weapon. Greatsword with a strength scaling and dex scaling of 80%. The other scalings, Great Axe Warhammer 100% strength, Sword and Hatchet 90 strength, 65 dexterity, and Spear 65 strength and 90 dexterity. I think the scaling shift is very interesting. I feel like a lot of Greatsword builds will still run 300 strength just to get the grit though. But I have to test some more with that, with the alternative options that you have in that regard as well. Then we have the stance themes. Opposing forces are a common theme throughout New World. Stances take a similar approach, but are broadly themed around offense and defense. Additional themes include angelic, demonic, fire and water, barbarian, knight, yin and yang, chaos, and order and chaos. Not quite sure why they're naming all of these. I feel like they're not all implemented in the stances. And then we have the stance visuals and HUD. Stance differences are primarily depicted through visual elements. This helps the player immediately recognize their active stance based on color. The HUD reinforces stance indicators with small icons, almost like a backup rather than the main expression of the stance. Players typically focus on the action in the center of the screen, so the small icons help bring their attention to the active stance in situations where the screen elements might be obscured. Here's some of the early HUD concepts, including pros and cons for each. Highlight icon over the weapon slot. We already do something similar for the sword and shield. The shield icon is shown in the corner of the sword icon. Cons. Weapon icons are in the corner of the screen, meaning the player must take their eyes off their character to check. I think this is a very important, very good point. Like, you're not actively looking in the corner of the screen usually. Colored highlight over the stance status effect. Calls for attention to an already existing game element. The con is that status effect icons can move around as the player receives more of them. Yeah, I'm not really sure if this is really just referring to the icon, then those, I feel like they're not particularly good. Icon next to the health bar. Pros players often look at the health bar, which is close to the icon. Cons, at that time, the spot was used by the in combat icon. They actually moved that in the patch, I think, so I guess that's kind of ironic. And then icon under the health bar. Pros centered on the character and health bar. Cons might get overlooked at the bottom of the screen. I think that is going to be the case. So I'm very glad that they went, especially with the targeter, but also with the visual effects on it being very strong, like very, very recognizable, very like switching from red to blue depending on which stance you're in. But like the target itself showing you which stance you're in is most definitely the most obvious way, because you're always going to see a targeter. That is the point of the screen you're looking at. And it's a very clear visual cue which stance you're in. So I really like those aspects of strong visual clarity when they do that well. And in this case, they've absolutely done that well. And I like that they're putting a lot of thought into that as well. But yeah, that's my breakdown, and it's a bit of a taste of what's to come for the Greatsword. I will go into a lot of this more in depth in the next days and show you more about the Greatsword mechanics and how things really play out when you're testing this weapon. So, if you'd like to see that and you're not subscribed yet, please consider subscribing and clicking the bell. Thanks for watching. SLOTH out.